Right, I think that is everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the second event in the series Towards Another Architecture. This has been organised by the Farrell Centre, which is a new public centre for architecture and cities in Newcastle in the UK, and it's in collaboration with the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape at Newcastle University. If you joined us for the first lecture in the series just before Christmas, the preamble may be familiar to you, but for those who weren't able to join us then, I thought it'd be useful just to briefly go through the concept behind this series. Today we live at a pivotal moment for architecture and the wider world, one which in many ways echoes the one 100 years ago that spurred the emergence of modernism. And the starting point for this series really is the realization that it's now 100 years since the first essays that would later form Le Corbusier's Vers in Architecture were first published in L'Esprit Nouveau. Modern life demands and is waiting for a new kind of plan, both for the house and the city, Le Corbusier wrote. And this series emerges from the contention that what we need to make sense of our present moment of transition, of political, economic, environmental, technological flux is not a new architecture, as Le Corbusier was popularly mistranslated as advocating, but another one, an architecture that's not bound to a single vision or future, but is diverse, pluralist, and sustains multiple conversations about the active role that architects might play in the world. So this series is conceived, therefore, to invite a number of practitioners and thinkers working in a broad range of fields and geographies to reflect on what this pivotal moment might mean for architecture through their practice, and to advocate explicitly or implicitly for their visions for another architecture. So the format is 30 minutes presentation followed by 30 minutes Q&A. So please have your questions ready. I'm delighted this evening to welcome Alice Brownfield as our speaker. Alice is an architect. She is Associate Director at Peter Barber Architects. She's also Chair of Part W and the Trustee for Action on Empty Homes. She is the recipient of the 2021 MJ Long Prize for Excellence in Practice in recognition of her housing work and advocacy for equity in the built environment. And she's been a design tutor and visiting critic, as well as a lecturer at a number of UK schools of architecture. So Alice, welcome, and over to you.
Hi, thanks very much, Owen, and thank you for inviting me along to be part of this series. I think it's a really interesting premise towards another architecture, and delighted to sort of share some ideas with you, and thank you to everyone who's come along. Hopefully it'll be an interesting 30 minutes and then some discussion afterwards. As Owen mentioned, let's just share my screen 1 second. As Owen mentioned, I'm an Associate Director at Peter Barber Architects. Hopefully you can see a couple of snapshots of our office on the screen at the moment. It's our little office in King's Cross. A little shop front, all of our models on the ground floor. We're a small practice, but we're known for our award-winning high-density street-based housing. We work a lot with local authorities and co-housing groups, helping deliver public housing schemes, social housing, and genuinely affordable housing. These are some of our most recent projects, which I will go into a bit more detail later. Outside of practice, I'm also chair of Part W Collective. Part W Collective is an action group of women who work in the built environment, whether it's architects, engineers, transport planners, etc., who campaign for gender equity within the built environment. And that's both within the professions themselves, but also within the design of the built environment, of the spaces we inhabit every day. And it's important for me to note that Part W was founded by an amazing woman called Zoe Berman, who you can see in the centre of this image here. And it was founded around a time where, back in 2017, where we were seeing globally women's rights and human rights in general coming under threat. And as architects, sort of thinking about the idea that we are inherently sort of linked to these issues in our work that we're doing and the built spaces that we are designing. Part of our work at Part W has been about addressing representation and underrepresentation and recognition of women in architecture and engineering. This is an example which I'll just fly through very quickly to demonstrate one of our many projects that we've done so far. This looks at the just one example, which is the RIBA Gold Medal at the time of our campaign in 2019. These are the names of the people that had won the annual medal in 173 years. These are the women who had won the medal. You can see there's 4 women who'd won it at that point in time, and that's the only woman that had won it in her own right. So we set about participatory activism, which we really enjoy doing. It's really good fun, but also it gets people involved, and we are, after all, just a group ourselves, so we want more diverse voices and to encourage both men and women to get involved, and all genders. So we invited people to submit nominations for women, and we created an alternative list, which was 173 years of women who could have won that award in that year. Moving on, and I'll talk a bit more about Part W's work in terms of the design of the built environment and equity in that respect, but I'm also a trustee for the charity Action on Empty Homes, which are a really fantastic charity. I'd really encourage you to go and check them out online. Action on Empty Homes campaign for long-term empty homes to be brought back into use for people in housing need. And I'll cover more about that. And as Owen said, I was really chuffed last year to be awarded the MJ Long Prize, a recognition of my work in practice at Peter Barber's, but also for the advocacy work that I do. But it's really important for me to say that everything I'm going to talk about today is things that I'm a fairly small part in, but sort of rely on a huge group of people. And so it's my sort of pleasure to sort of help sort of convey some of the ideas that we've been thinking about. I think I'm going to talk for just under 30 minutes, and I'd really like to talk about sort of the theme of Towards Another Architecture. I'd like to talk about our approach to the housing crisis as architects and designers, and our agency in doing that. But first of all, to sort of set some context, sort of about the housing crisis that we're currently experiencing, that we have been for a while. We are obviously one of the richest countries in the world, but we currently have 274,000 people in England who are homeless. Just under half of those are children. So it's quite sort of, hard-hitting stats, and obviously it's really important to remember that behind these stats there are individual lives. And if we just go back a step, slightly more optimistically, but just to kind of look at what's happened very briefly over the last sort of half a century. Post-war, the government was building over 150,000 homes a year. A real sort of drive, a commitment to good housing seen as basic infrastructure. And that was at the same time that we were founding the National Health Service. And we'd obviously were fairly financially hamstrung at the time as well. This is currently, as is the person sleeping rough in London in a subway. And this is a one-bed flat in Knightsbridge that was on the market for £15 million. So I've kind of just used these 2 images to really hammer home the sort of real lives behind these things that we talk about as architects and designers, but also the fact that this is about inequity. It's about unequal distribution of wealth and access to affordable housing. And we as citizens and as designers are complicit in this. We have ways in which we can take action against this. And then I'd also just like to bring in some of the work and the research that we do at Part W, and also bring a gender perspective to this. We know that women experience built environment differently, and that they also have different access to housing. In the UK, the average UK rents are about 43% of women's median earnings in comparison to men's. It's just 28% of men's. We also know that women need nearly 12 times the annual salaries to be able to buy a house in England, whereas men need 8 times. I mean, both of those are crazy, but there's a huge disparity there. And whilst the majority of people who are recorded as sleeping on the streets in the UK are male, 67% of those who are statutorily homeless are women. So it's really important that we kind of have these other perspectives in the work that we're doing. And I'd also just like to set up a question which is about this sort of housing need and housing supply. And we in this country sort of talk about not being able to build homes quick enough. And I just wanted to point out and kind of draw attention to the fact that we have in Britain nearly 359,000 empty homes, yet we only have 330,000 people who are on temporary housing or homeless. Now I say only because not because that's a good number, but because there are a huge number of empty homes which we could be utilising. Some of those empty homes, and this is drawing on research by Action on Empty Homes, and you can see here their Sex Pistol inspired Pretty Vacant report. Some of those empty homes are in London, whereby we are seeing homes being bought up as sort of investment vehicles. And there's a really great report here if you're interested in finding out more to go and have a look at. But the majority of long-term empty homes in England are in the northeast, and there are many areas of the country where there are sort of series of streets which are empty, and there are kind of many reasons for this. One of the main reasons being the lack of sort of infrastructure there, the lack of access to jobs and to services and amenities, and therefore antisocial behaviour and houses becoming unmaintained and derelict. And so just to sort of give a context to the work I'm about to show you is to really think about our role as architects and whether we, should be building lots more new housing, whether we should be campaigning and trying to find ways in which to facilitate the use of buildings which already exist. And we can look to examples like the Turner Prize-winning Assembles project with Granby 4 Street CLT up in Liverpool, which brought 4 streets, or is bringing 4 streets back into use and addressing the wider issues around those. And I'd also really encourage you, if you are interested, to support Action Empty Homes campaign, which is calling for empty homes to be used as a sort of retrofit revolution, as a means of retrofitting a huge number of homes at once, as examples, as case studies, to bring them back into use as zero emission social housing. It sounds all a bit doom and gloom, but I promise it's going to become more optimistic. But the other aspect I wanted to touch on was not only the number of empty homes that we have in the country, but also the amount of demolition that is happening at the moment. And we see, particularly in London, but in lots of cities, in Manchester, the demolition of existing housing estates, of social housing, which not only obviously disrupts the sort of well-integrated network community, but also has a massive carbon implication. A few years ago, David Cameron talked about demolishing council estates, and I just wanted to read you a very quick quote. He said, "Post-war estates across the country are ripe for redevelopment. We will sweep away planning blockages and take new steps to reduce political and reputational risk for project investors and developers. I believe that together we can tear down everything that stands in our way." And a lot of it is being replaced with stuff like this. This is 9 Elms in Battersea at the bottom of your screen. These are typically not re-providing the levels of social housing that they replaced, let alone the carbon that they have, the emissions from the demolition and the new buildings. We know that affordable housing in London, where it's tied to market rates, is not affordable. So we need new models coming through, but also as architects and designers, we need to be able to question these. We need to find solutions which doesn't involve the demolition of buildings unnecessarily. We also know that even if you build a passive house home, if you have demolished a building to build that home, it takes about 30 years in use to recoup the carbon that you have lost from demolishing that home. So the very first principle that we would argue for in the office is that we should try to avoid demolition. And I just wanted to show you some of the projects that we've done at Peter Barber Architects in the last few years, or that we're currently working on, which try to rethink about how we should approach housing and an issue of supply. So the first one is a project called Kiln Place in the London Borough of Camden in central, just north London. It's a project which is on an estate which was built originally in the 1970s. And on the left-hand side, you can see the existing estate plan. On the right-hand side, you can see the proposed. The estate has a really amazing community there. Most of them have either lived there since the 70s or their parents have. They go on an annual trip to Brighton, to Seaside, as a kind of holiday together. It's a really, seriously, a really unique place in that neighbourhood. But architecturally and spatially, it becomes a slight problem. You don't walk through the estate unless you live there, because there's a railway to the south, and there is a sort of massive change of level to the east. So you would walk around, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but you would walk around the outside rather than passing through. And we were appointed by Camden and the residents, because we had an interview with the residents themselves, which is always good fun and I think quite important, to provide new homes across the estate without demolishing any existing, and also to provide a series of wider estate improvements. So we set about trying to find sites with the residents that we could place new homes, but also that would introduce streets through the estate. So you can see on the right hand side, there's a row of 6 homes here. They look a bit like a sort of fishbone. That's because of the trunk sewer, which runs down here, lots of site constraints and district heating everywhere. But it's trying to carry a street through the estate. There's some new homes on this side too, and then there are homes in the corner plots of these existing buildings which rationalise previous entrances. Some of the homes are tucked into existing old oil tank rooms and provide new roof terraces for existing residents. And we've created new paths through the estate so that it becomes much more permeable, much better overlooked. And we've given, for example, at ground floor here and along here, where residents previously accessed their homes by coming up half a flight of stairs and along a corridor, we've taken out that wall, we've created a new square, new path, and now residents have their own front gardens when they come into their house from a street. This is an aerial photo of the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, just a kind of more zoomed-in image just to show some of the other moves that we were making, which were quite subtle, to sort of resolve some of the issues in terms of refuse, storage, and access. And these are some photos of the buildings that they've been built. On the left, you can see this new street coming through the estate, and on the right, you can see one of the corner homes. On the left in this image, you can see that new street, and then on the right, you can see the square with the new path running up to the new front garden. So if you walked up these steps, you can access these front gardens, and this green space is now accessible. Previously, it was completely inaccessible apart from the caretaker. So there are some smaller moves which we hope have really fundamentally improved the conditions for existing residents, and the houses are integral to that. They're not separate things. These are some of the interiors that we're using a sort of notch typology to try and get homes that are quite close together without impinging on people's privacy, whilst making sure they're nice and bright. This is just an example which is at a slightly larger scale than Kiln Place. Kiln Place is on this map here, just to the top right, and this is Wendley Estate, which is just sort of 2 minutes walk away. Wendley Estate is larger. It's 240 home estate. It's much more complicated. It's built on various different levels. If we take this image here, for example, all of this area is built up on a deck access. There's a small tower block here, which has a sunken basement to it. And it's incredibly difficult to navigate. And as a result, there are lots of places which are poorly overlooked. And we were appointed by Camden again to work with the residents to actually propose 3 options. One was for full demolition, one was for no demolition, and one was somewhere in the middle. And I wanted to present to you today the sort of proposal that we finished with, which was, having explored all those options, what we had worked up with the residents. So on the left-hand side, you can see the existing plan, and you can see in sort of grey hatched areas, these are the raised areas, lots of deck access, not very easy to sort of navigate through, and also not at grade to the surrounding buildings and the surrounding streets. And on the right hand side, you can see the proposed plan. It's a very sort of high level plan, but I can show you more detail in a minute, which is effectively to introduce streets north-south and east-west, and kind of knit it into the surrounding area much more effectively, so people do walk through. It also brings everything back down to street level. And the way that we have done this is to reconfigure some of the blocks. So of the 240 homes, we would need to remove 12 of them. And obviously that isn't said lightly, those are 12 people's homes, but we are providing nearly 180 new homes on an estate of 240 homes. So we're getting close to almost doubling the density without sort of large scale demolition. This is a model which just shows you in yellow the new buildings and the old buildings in white. And you can just see here, for example, we're creating this new route through by taking out one of the ends of the blocks here just to free up this route. So they are kind of very simple moves that are proposed to enable that to happen. And you can start to see here in a bit more detail the idea of streets opening up into squares, new rows of buildings, the green spaces being open to all who live around here, and also increasing their own private gardens, which used to be very narrow, and again addressing the railway line. And the benefit of this scheme was that the client could phase the project and wouldn't necessarily have to enter a joint venture with the developer. For example, you could build the right of housing on the railway line fairly independently to the rest of the estate to cross-subsidise the rest of the housing. And this is one of Pete Barber's sketches of what it might look like, which I think is kind of fairly lovely and animated. And this is an example of one of the squares, the north-south square I just showed you, coming up here, new homes in the corners, trying to rationalise what's happening there and creating these really well overlooked streets. Just very quickly, a couple more projects which are actually more looking at homelessness provision. This is Mount Pleasant Homeless Hostel in Camden again. We do work in other boroughs. On the left-hand side, you can see a site plan of what the building was like before. So it was in use as a homeless hostel, but it was a sort of H-shaped, kind of wonky H. It had these very tall but tiny little courtyards, which were not used really at all, apart from people to go and have a cigarette in. They weren't places that you would go and sit in. They didn't have very much light in them. And rather than remove this whole building, we made the decision to take out this central part. And so on the right-hand side, you can see the proposed building, what has been built. That provides a new building to the east and opens this whole area up to be a little courtyard, and puts a new couple of homes in this corner too. So we actually increased the provision of homes in this hostel, but also increased the provision of ensuite bedrooms and independent units. And the courtyard really acts as the social heart of the scheme. So here are some photos. The brilliance of this courtyard is that and that we sort of hear from the people who work in the hostel and the residents, and we go back there most years and we do open house with them, and Pete goes and does lots of gardening club with the residents, is that because you have to pass through this space, whether it's rain or shine, you have to pass through it. Therefore, you are more likely to bump into someone than you are in a traditional hostel setting where there are lots of corridors and sort of airlocks that you have to go through. And what that means is that there are more occasions where you're likely to have an incidental conversation with someone. You not have to make an appointment to talk to someone. They might just be sat on the bench and they say, hello, how's your day going? And we've made design decisions like putting a laundry off the of that space, so that space becomes even more well populated. And you can just see here how bright that courtyard is now, and some of the plants that Pete was putting in with the residents. Another homeless hostel, which is a sort of T-shaped building in Kentish Town, again in London, and we were asked by the borough to think about how to re-provide some more independent units, homes rather. This was a view down one of the existing corridors. So there's a building at the front, which is a beautiful Victorian building, but then this building to the rear, it was a very long thin corridor, double banked with rooms either side. Not a space that makes you feel able to, access support and get back on your feet. It's a space which feels institutionalized. And we looked at almshouse precedents. These are some Dutch almshouses. And this is one of Pete's sketches of the proposal, the earlier proposal, which was to retain this existing building and reconfigure it to make it work much better for counselling services, communal kitchen, etc., and to provide a rind of new homes around a new courtyard and allotment space. And crucially, because we have provided these around an outside space, we can put all of the budget into these homes, not internal corridors. So each of these is a little micro home, which you can see here, very slim. And this is one of Pete's lovely sketches showing what that might be like one day, and a little model showing what those micro homes are like. And so everyone has, through their front door, a little kitchenette, a little desk area, a little ensuite, and then up some stairs to a bed space. So there's a double height space and there's roof lights at the top as well. And this is the space when it was just finished. Camden are working with residents who want to learn about agriculture, about growing, about nutrition, to make sure that this space does become that lively, sort of planted out, growing lots of things, an old shed in there and stuff. So, but crucially, it retains the existing building at the front and rationalises it, making it work. I think I've just got a few more minutes, probably about 7 more minutes. So I just want to touch on one more project and then finish up by talking about some of Part W's work. This is a project for the London Borough of Newham in East London. It looks at the old back-to-back house types, which were common in the northeast of England and the north of England in the Industrial Revolution. They were very good ways, cheap ways of building mass housing for workers. They had a number of positives. They were not only cheap to build because they are back-to-back. So there are, just looking at this plan here, you've got one home backing on to another home. So they face a street, there are no rear gardens, and there's a courtyard into the rear. So they had a number of positives. One was that they were very cheap to build because you've only got sort of one of your 4 sides as an external wall. They are also arranged around streets, so they're very kind of legible. They encourage social action, kind of pushing people into the public space. But there were some negatives as well, which were about sanitation. People shared a bathroom, and about ventilation because they were single aspect. And we kind of thought about that typology, and we also thought about this sort of stoop typology and people sitting out in the front of their homes. This is a site that we were given in Newham, an empty site with housing to the north of it and a street running around the corner. And this is one of Pete's early sketches for the project, which looks at that back-to-back typology and resolves some of the issues that it had, whilst also sort of building a very high quality, but essentially quite a cheap and energy efficient way of building new homes. So all of these homes around these 2 edges are back to back. So this is a 4-storey 2-bed house, and it backs on to this house here. These houses obviously front onto the street, and these ones front onto a new courtyard. And so you can see in the bottom right what that looks like in context. One of Pete's lovely sketches of the elevation, what that could be like. And the crucial thing to say about this is that these are all social unit or affordable rent homes. Really a credit to Newham, and this is really lovely that we won the RIBA Neave Brown Award for this year, which is really fascinating, fantastic given how remarkable Neave Brown was. So on the left, I've just put an image which shows you sort of traditional back-to-back houses, and on the right you can see the floor plans. So a typical house, we have a kitchen at ground floor, a bedroom at first floor with a bathroom, and then repeated again at second floor with a balcony, and then a living space at top floor. So very efficient plans, but crucially, everyone has their own bathroom. In fact, they have 3, and also the living spaces are dual aspect at the top with the roof terraces. So this is one of the models that we made in the office to test it out and reassure ourselves and the planners. And this is what it looked like at completion, through into the courtyard. And you can see some of the houses are 3 stories on the left-hand side, where we had to be much more sensitive to the houses opposite. And this is what it looks like inside. So it's really bright. There's a really nice connection to the street because of the arch depth. People are putting out pots and plants in their arches, cargo bikes, all that sort of stuff. So it's been really lovely going back and seeing that become much more animated. And then just before I end, I just wanted to kind of draw back upon the work that Part W does, and really sort of focus, I guess, on an idea about gender mainstreaming in design. Gender mainstreaming is the use of a gender perspective when making decisions or policy. And there are really good examples in Europe of this working really well. Vienna has a gender mainstreaming in urban design guidance booklet, which is fascinating. Barcelona are really taking this on board in lots of public spaces. And what you're seeing on this screen is, to the left-hand side, a park in Barcelona that was designed as a feminist park. It was designed in collaboration with local women and children. And I just use it as one example of ways in which, as architects, we need to be questioning the ways that we are designing, making sure that we are designing equitably for people who have different experiences to ourselves. We need to make sure our own design teams are diverse, but we also need to make sure that the process of design is diverse too. And so this park, for example, has a very wide perimeter. It's arranged around a few different interlocking spaces rather than one main sort of football pitch, for example. There is a really good provision of seating. There's a good provision of public toilets, which is really important, and it's kind of really interesting precedent for something that perhaps we should be adopting much more in the UK. If we look at transport as well, we know that women do 75% of the world's unpaid care work. That tends to mean that women's journeys often aren't just A to B, they often are sort of multi-chained journeys. And so often our transport links are designed to be from the outskirts to the middle of a city or a town, and actually prioritising routes around the radial routes is really important in terms of making sure that our transport systems are equitable. The Hopper Fare was a really good example of this, and anyone who's read Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez will have heard about this before, but the idea that you don't have to pay per bus, but you just pay for your journey was really a significant way of equalising transport and means of transport for men and women. And I mentioned it earlier, but just also to really question the process of how we design. We are often involved quite closely with local communities when we're designing, which is just really important, particularly when we're working on projects where we are building in between existing homes in a very tight manner, because we absolutely need that local knowledge. We need to understand how things are working. Sometimes things surprise us, things that we think will probably work all right aren't working very well. And it's that knowledge and that different lived experience which is really important to bring. And I think there are some fantastic examples of lots of different practices doing that, and something that we should all be taking on board as a sort of forgetting the sort of master architecture that perhaps Corbusier's era may have once had, and understanding the importance of collective action. This is a slide here coming towards the end, just of some references that we found really interesting in our work at Part W. The one at the bottom left is Vienna's Guidance to Gender Mainstreaming in Urban Planning, which is really interesting to read. And just a quick plug, we're a voluntary organisation, we're a community interest company. If you would like to support our work at Part W, we'd love to hear from you. Please keep in touch, follow us. And just to end on a note, which is to also say these are other fantastic groups of people who are seeing their role as architects as more than just people who sort of sit at a drawing board and design something, but as having agency, and also the importance of kind of collective action. So I'm going to leave it there, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time for discussion. Thank you.
Alice, thank you so much for this extraordinary projects and work. Just amazing to see. So as Alice mentioned, there is time for questions, and you stuck amazingly to time as well. You've managed to compress so much in, so we have plenty of time for questions. So if you would like to ask something, if you could first put your question in the chat, and then we will come to you directly, and my colleague Mike will unmute you, and you can ask your question yourself rather than through me. But I will kick things off because I don't yet see the chat coming alive yet, but I'm sure it will very shortly. It was amazing seeing those projects, some of which are kind of have been heavily published, but to hear you talk about them and to go through the design approach was really fascinating. You sort of make it sound so easy. I suspect it isn't. But what sort of challenges do you face? I mean, working with local authorities. I mean, you showed a lot of projects in Camden, and clearly they are at the more enlightened end of the spectrum, I think it's fair to say. But how do you find working with them? What's the most challenging aspect of realizing projects of that nature?
I think we really love working with London boroughs, and not just Camden, but whole host. I mean, we were working with Greenwich, Newham, with Barking, Dagenham, you know, Hounslow, Havering, a whole host of London boroughs over the last sort of 15, 20 years. And there are still like sort of remains of this sort of social intention, a sort of idea of the welfare state that is really genuinely trying to find solutions to provide affordable, genuinely affordable and social rent homes. The challenges are always to do with funding. And therefore, I think as architects, we can sometimes think that's a separate issue to us. So, but there are ways in which design can help that. You know, we can think about ways in which the design can allow phasing. We can think about ways in which the design can reduce costs. So a lot of our projects are house-based, not all of them, but a lot of them are house-based. You know, and by that I mean that people have their own front door onto a street, in comparison to a flatted block where you might have, you know, one front door and you come in and there's corridors, etc. And what that means is that you aren't, as a sort of developer, as a London Borough as a developer, they aren't spending money building spaces which they can't rent or they can't sell. So, you know, i.e. the communal cores, the lift shafts, the communal bin stalls, the stairways, etc. So we can make sure through design that we can help, you know, get value for money in that sense, and ultimately help reduce housing waiting lists. And I think, I mean, it's obviously crucial to say that the projects I've shown you and the work that we've done as an office, as a relatively small office, don't even scratch the surface in trying to sort of re-provide the social housing that we've lost. And I had meant to say earlier that when I was talking about the post-war stuff, I'd meant to say that in 1977, nearly half our population lived in social housing. And then we had the 1977 Housing Act. And now 15% of people live in social housing. So there's a real sort of like, you know, huge diminishment of, you know, accessible housing. And so I think it's refreshing working with London boroughs, but it's very challenging because of how many hoops they have to jump through. And I showed you Kiln Place, which won the New London Architecture Housing Award last year, which is really fantastic, but huge credit to the client, the individual at Camden, who, you know, found ways to make that work. And half those homes, just under half those homes, are for social rent in perpetuity. And you know, the credit to that individual who managed to find a way to do that is quite remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. So the chat has come alive as predicted. So the first question is from my colleague Juliet Odgers, who Mike hopefully will make appear any second. She describes it as a banal question, but actually I don't think it is, because it's about, well, it corresponds to a lot of the things you were just saying about value. Juliet.
I am sorry. I couldn't unmute myself. Hi, Alice.
Hi, Juliet.
That's really, really enjoyable. It's so lovely to see this great work. Actually working with second years at the moment, and we've been doing social housing. So all of these things, you know, if I'd been better educated, I would have showed all of your schemes to them as brilliant investments. And it's just lovely to see. Anyway, I have this question which I'm constantly debating with my students. My students, as a default, put an ensuite bathroom with every single bedroom that they create, irrespective of the social grouping. So you've got, you know, in one case, this is a house for a seven person refugee family. So they've got, you know, the 3 kids' bedrooms and a parent's bedroom, and each of the kids' bedrooms has got an ensuite bathroom, and then on top of that they've got another bathroom which is accessible from the sort of living area. So, you know, it seems to me that it couldn't really go any further in terms of density of bathroom provision. And I look at these things and I think, yeah, and this is for, you know, this is for emergency housing. Why are you doing this? Can't we just have a bigger living room? But I'm interested in it because, you know, social mores really change, and I'm aware that developer housing now, if you've got a 2-bedroom flat, a developer will put 2 bathrooms in for sure. And I'm just wondering, in the arena of social housing, how, you said, you know, importantly, this is everyone's got a bathroom, and I'm just interested in the why that is. I mean,
yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Well, the McGrath rating was more a reference to the sort of solution in comparison to the sort of old back-to-back housing where you would have shared a bathroom per street. You know, you had physically go out.
Sure.
They but and they just sort of, perhaps that's not the great example for your students because they're doing what they're doing. But I mean, we don't design the homes which are built and are ultimately socially rented are not designed any differently in our minds to those that would be for market sale. And I think there probably is a sort of developer kind of crush on everyone having en suites and stuff, but it's not something that we've really come across people requesting often. I think one of the things that I could say, I guess, is that our homes tend to be quite efficient in plan, and really they do that by avoiding lots of internal corridors within the home itself. So I've talked previously about kind of communal corridors, but I also mean private corridors in homes. So that often means that we are meeting the overall, sort of on the line for the overall GIA of a flat, of a house, but often all of the rooms themselves are over the individual room requirement. They're more generous because we haven't got spaces which are kind of circulation spaces so much. So it means that bedrooms can be bigger, living spaces can be bigger. So sometimes you can fit an ensuite in, and people like doing that. But yeah.
But I'm just wondering, if you are doing sort of social housing for families specifically, I don't know whether it ever gets as fine-grained as that. Would you think that 3 bathrooms is a good idea in a 3-bedroom unit? I mean, I'm just interested because it seems such a priority amongst the generation of students who are now sort of 20 years old.
Yeah, no, I think people would rather have a bigger living space probably, but
okay, that's good. That's good. I just wanted a little, you're halfway house between me and them. I just, just trying to update myself. Good. Yeah. Thank you for that.
If it's a generational thing, I don't know, but
I shall continue my crusade. Communal showers, yay. Okay, right, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 2 further questions in the chat. John Hyam, would you like to unmute yourself, or Mike will do that for you?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Alice. It was so exciting. It was a really wonderful talk. My question was about current building standards and the gap between them and a high-level building standard that you mentioned, Passive House, and how you negotiate where you feel you need to be within that gap, and whether you feel the need to aim high so the housing has as low an impact as possible, or whether because of other reasons you feel that's not achievable and perhaps there has to then be a pathway to improvements, thermal improvements over time.
Yeah, no, that's a really useful question, and I mean there are so many people who are better qualified to talk about it than me, but from my experience and our experience at PBA, I'd say that there is clearly a difference between local authority briefs, where the client will ultimately be maintaining those homes for a very long time, renting them out, in comparison to private developers who will be selling them. There is a kind of clear investment and understanding of the sort of long-term value of designing homes to a very high sustainability criteria, because obviously that ultimately reduce things like fuel bills and long-term maintenance. So there's kind of invested interest in local authority. So we're seeing in a lot of our local authority briefs that there are much higher than basic building regs requirements for sustainability performance and sort of embodied carbon in the projects, which is really positive. We're not seeing that in more private developer-led schemes, which ultimately in the world we live in is understandable, because that is a business model which is often prioritizes profit over other things, and there's less of an interest in that longer term benefit. And I guess we would love to be doing more work which is passive house, which is looking at what different ways that we can kind of ensure that we're using less embodied carbon in our projects. And we're really excited to work with clients that want to do that. And ultimately, when we have a kind of project that has an existing building on the site, our first thing to do is to always think, how can we try to retain that building unless unless obviously it's not structurally viable. So
I was really excited by that presumption not to demolish and to retrofit. That was I hadn't known that about your work, and that was really good to hear.
Great, thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have two further questions in the chat, which are sort of related to each other. So I think maybe we'll take them together, if that's all right. So Michael Bland, if you could ask your question, then we'll go straight to James, and Alice will hopefully be able to respond to both simultaneously.
Yeah, cool. Shall I start then?
Please go. Yeah.
I think sort of my original question was almost a little bit of a rant, really. So I think rephrasing it is actually, because one of the root of these problems is really as a society, what do we view when we, what do we say when we want homes? What do people really want? What do developers think people want, based on what they know? Because obviously developers generally know that the standard house types sell. But they're generally quite inefficient when it comes to the use of space, which is, I guess, it's probably become more prevalent in London because of the lack of space. But even in northern territories, we shouldn't really be wasting space. We should be building efficiently designed buildings, which you said yourself in the presentation, generally are more social as well, and they do generally harbour more social cohesion. So what advice can you give someone who's working in the north, where even local authorities, councils are building houses to maintain? How have you got any advice for breaking away from standard house types, and from what's the approach to design in terms of being quite innovative with the character as well? In terms of, because one of the things that gets pushed quite a lot is a traditional character, but that beyond aesthetics, it actually does limit you to standard house types. It stops you from being able to do interesting things like roof terraces, which are quite clever with space, or from having larger windows and things like that.
Right.
Thank you. So that I think tees up James's question really nicely. So we'll go straight to you, James, and then Alice will respond. If he's here, that is.
I can read it. So he said, PBA's architecture has a very particular image/approach that seems inextricably linked to the dense London context. What are your key practice values that can have broad applicability for housing in varied contexts? So yeah, I guess kind of very similar questions. I guess the first thing to sort of say is that some of the work we're doing, is, I guess, sort of slightly innovative. It's sort of reinventing things, but really a lot of it is just looking at old precedents. So a lot of the work we're doing looks at precedents like the almshouses, which I showed earlier, but also the old cottage flats, where you have, two front doors very close together, and one comes into a ground floor home and one goes straight up to a first floor home. Looking at back-to-back housing, so looking at really, in some ways, quite old types of housing, and trying to understand what didn't work very well about them, and trying to sort of resolve those issues. And so in many ways, the work has kind of like a grounding in previous built examples. And we, even in London, we have conversations where people sort of think that's a really unusual house type. It's got a living space upstairs and the bedrooms are downstairs, for example. And so I think I can understand your question is to sort of say that the context would be even more challenging outside of London, in the north. But I think perhaps some of the solutions might be the same. I don't want to sort of guess, but a lot of what we have to do is try and take people to projects to try and reassure them, and that not just our own, but examples of projects of old almshouses, for example. We take planners to a lot of our projects when we can convince them to take time out because they're often very under-resourced, and just try to reassure them. We show loads of precedent photos of new streets and stuff, and actually a lot of what we're talking about is fairly sort of high value traditional stuff, and so it kind of has a cottagey feel, and I think that can reassure people. And we do a lot of work in outer London boroughs, so we've done a lot of work in Barking and Dagenham, for example, some work in Redbridge, very outer parts of Greenwich where it's very low density, very suburban. So we do have these conversations. You know, it's still London, but it's very suburban, and sometimes bringing people back to those precedents can really help. And I don't know whether that also answers James's question. Yeah, I think it's just kind of about trying to reassure people by showing them previous examples that are in the context. So we've got a project down in Torquay at the moment, which obviously is like even further from the north, but is a challenging context. But there are examples that can be found in the local area where the principles are the same, what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think so, because one of the things that we sort of come across quite a lot is, you know, a couple of the projects that I'm working on at the moment are in quite high density areas where you've got lots of terrace houses, which, you know, obviously space efficient, you know, and, you know, in order to kind of lock into that context, you could propose something which is a sort of set of terraces, which might be quite innovative, but set of terraces, but generally, you know, in terms of having access to the rear without having a street at the back, then becomes a problem. So even in sort of like, you know, those sort of high density areas, I find us just kind of then still going back to things like semis or detached units, yet trying to kind of weave in some kind of like tenuous local context into that somehow. And I guess it's like, you know, it's sort of how to tackle that, so is it a case of literally just going into you know, an initial meeting with a client or with a planner and saying, look, we want to do something like this. This is what we've done before, or this is what we've seen before elsewhere.
Well, I guess so. It's sort of, you know, it's reviewing the site, going to the site, understanding what kind of challenges and opportunities of the site, and then thinking about things from an urban perspective first. You know, Pete always talks about looking at things as, you know, housing projects. I think in London, I don't know what it is in Newcastle, but in London, about 70% of the buildings are housing. So when we're designing a bit of housing, we're thinking about it as a bit of city. And so thinking about it from that level first, and then coming into sort of more detailed level of design. So yeah, I think, you know, we've got projects where I didn't show them today, but Ordnance Road is a project up in Enfield, sort of outskirts of Enfield in North London, is a terrace of houses, but rather that you just said you're not accessible from the rear, we introduced little mews at the back with a little row of bungalows for elderly people to live in, to downsize into, which actually also benefited the existing community. So there are kind of examples, I guess, of where these sort of these typologies derived from older typologies are also useful to be able to make offerings to existing communities and residents, and ultimately make sure that you're not just providing new homes for other people, but you're improving the area around too. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I did have another question, but I see there's some other questions in the chat. So
put it in the chat, and we may have time to come to it. So there is another question in the chat. Shemal, would you like to ask your question?
Hello. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that great talk. I think I was just thinking about your end to the talk about architects being more than just people on the drawing board, and our role in shaping ideas at a kind of wider societal role, and also reflecting on 100 years since Corbusier's first towards new architecture, I guess, is with your projects, are you having to find clients that are already bought into the ideas you pursue as a practice, or are they coming to you, or are you having to do a lot of the challenging of or introducing of new ideas yourself? And I'm thinking about it in sort of a similar context as the previous questions of what can we do as practitioners in the north to foster a new culture as well, and I don't know, I guess help create the clients that we want and need. Yeah,
sure. That's a really interesting question, actually. I wish they were all coming to us. That would be really nice. We've won loads of awards in the last year, but we do need some more work. So we kind of happily hand back an award, I think, for another project. But in all seriousness, I mean, there are some really fantastic clients out there. There's some really interesting private developers. There's people like Town doing really interesting work. And there are sort of the alternatives to things like, you know, sort of fairly horrendous MIPIM. You know, there's Christine Murray's Festival of Place, which is a really exciting, I think, really exciting sort of conversations coming out of that about the quality of the public space and the houses and buildings that we're building in the UK, and that have a much more sort of equitable basis and a social grounding. So there are kind of those interesting conversations going on. But most of the time we sort of have to kind of just kind of try and have conversations with new clients and understand, you know, what their priorities are and how we can feed into that. And we're working with a fantastic private developer called Kurapatra, who we're building lots of projects with at the moment, who you know, are sort of really remarkable at being able to believe in a vision which is very high density. So we're doing a project up in Barnet in North London, which was the largest in the London Mayor's small sites programme, and it had a capacity set of about 35 homes on it. And we're building 97 on the site in quite a suburban context, but crucially 83 of those 97 have their own front doors onto the new street that we're creating. So there's a kind of sort of street-based aspect to them. So and that's being built by Kurapatra, who are, you know, fantastic clients. So there are some people out there doing really interesting stuff. Yeah, and it's a bit of both, I guess. Some people sort of, we've had clients who've just walked past the shop front and come in, which is really nice, and said, I've got this site and I haven't got, I've just had refused planning permission, and can you give us a hand? So a mixture of things, but most of the time it's just trying to sort of bring people on board and reassure them that what we're doing is not just kind of socially minded, but it also has benefits, you know, financial benefits to, you know, not building 25% of area that's communal circulation that you can't sell, for example. Hope that helps.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I love the idea of a client just sort of stumbling into the office and leading to a job. I think that's really wonderful.
Net to kind of,
yeah. Absolutely.
I keep having this idea that we as architects really should be marketing ourselves to the public, in the sense that it's the public, you know, it's society, it's the communities that are living in the work that we produce. Those are the ones who've got the greatest stake in it. They don't normally know who we are. Yeah, you know, especially, you know, in the north, every time you're driving, you know, on bypasses or on the edgelands of suburbs, you see these developers with their billboards. That you know, and there's one near me where it says, you know, built by the you know, the best project manager in the UK or something, and it's, well, why is it not? Why is the architect not? You know, why are we not sort of, you know, we have billboards with our ideas as architects on town centres saying, look, this is what we want to provide, this is what we want to design. And then when people go to, you know, take this bit of paper to, you know, the sort of Taylor Wimpey or Persimmon and say, we want this, and then they go, oh, well, we don't have that, who makes that? And then they say, oh, well, it's this architect, you know. And that's, you know, that I feel like, you know, advertisement could be a really powerful tool for us as architects to show people what the better options are out there. You know, in terms of doing things differently.
Yeah, and I think ultimately we need a, you know, properly central government funded social housing building program. You know, we need that impetus to kind of give clients the sort of the ability to, you know, build really good housing that is affordable and accessible.
My question was actually going to be about sort of how do you manage, because obviously bespoke designs take more time to design when it's, you know, context specific than like just a standard house type that you can sort of cookie cut. But how much repetition is there between projects, and how much can you kind of like feed one project into another to kind of you know, to be efficient in that sense, especially when it comes to, you know, the actual, you know, the vastness of the housing need, and how many, you know, that this idea that we need houses and we need them fast. you know, and we need them cheap. How can we manage fees in a way which means that we can produce great design, but in an efficient way, which doesn't need to be kind of redone for every site?
Yeah, I mean, there are sort of outwardly there you know, there is sort of repetition, I guess, as sort of looking at our projects. There are sort of identifiable things that move between different sites, but it is every single one is we often get really tricky tight sites, and that's the sort of sites that we enjoy, to be honest. And so they are very contextual, but they do adopt similar principles. So there's you know, a lot of our projects have that sort of pizza slice, the sort of notch cut out of them, but you know, the reason for that is not some sort of like aesthetic whim. It's about creating high density homes that can be close together, because your primary outlook and your primary means of daylight and sunlight is sideways into your private space in comparison to, you know, across the road in someone else's house. So you're still overlooking that space but not relying on it. So there are principles that transfer, and that's quite useful. I think also because we're a small office, every single person in our office has construction experience. So from the beginning of a project, you're already thinking about how something might be built, which can be quite useful as well.
Thanks very much. So I've said Hazel's will be the last question, but if it's okay, I'll append a question of my own to it as well. I think it follows on from what Hazel's going to ask. So Hazel, wherever you are, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, Alice. I really thoroughly enjoyed that so much about my dinner. I wanted to ask, because obviously Peter Barber Architects have a really super refined approach to housing design and really intricate sites, this idea of like high density and low rise. And I guess this is sort of summing up, I've always wondered, is there, when you're in the office together, is there another type of project that you think I'd really love to have a go at that? We do that so well, applying the same principles.
Do you mean in terms? I don't know really. I think, I mean, we're a really small office, so you know, there aren't sort of like lots of different teams working on stuff, but there are obviously lots of different projects, and the kind of size projects that we work on often can be 1 or 2 people just sort of working on them, which is quite efficient. But I think we've been really fortunate in the last couple of years to have some really interesting projects, like Beechwood Mews, which is the one I mentioned earlier, which is along the North Circular, so a very challenging site, lots of air pollution, lots of noise, you know, lots of challenges there. But we've kind of designed this typology, which is, you know, effectively from the outside looks like one home, but there are 3 homes in it, and everyone has their own front door onto the street. So I think, because we're a small office and we kind of can sort of sense what everyone's working on and have these conversations, you know, it's fairly enjoyable. Sort of, even if someone else has got the gig working on it as project architect, you're kind of still involved quite heavily and helping out every now and then. But I don't know if that's answered your question, or maybe you were asking, do we want to work on other things other than housing, maybe?
Yeah, and I was always wondering if you think there's another fit for the kind of super intricate approach that the practice has into working into dense sites. If there's you always think, oh, I'd love to do a library or a chapel or something. Is there like a dream thing that you think, oh, we'd be so good at that?
Oh, I mean, because, you know, how we see housing as a piece of the city, we love doing projects where there are other aspects of the project other than housing. So Beechwood, which I talked about, has a local corner shop in it and a cafe, which is really fantastic. We've done a project in Greenwich, for Greenwich, which has a pub, which is just remarkable. You know, I don't think that a local authority has built a pub in probably since like the sort of Great Exhibition or something in 1951 or something. So you know, really remarkable to be involved in projects like that, and also they form a really crucial part of the scheme. So in that project, which is called Rochester Way, down in Kidbrooke, there are 3 new Mews streets, and the pub sort of sits at the end of one, overlooking a sort of green space with an area to sort of spill out onto, and there's a little corner shop, because when we were talking to residents at the beginning of the project, they said we have to get in a car to go and get a pint of milk. So, you know, we really enjoy doing those things where it's not just housing, but there are other aspects to it. And also things like, you know, community uses, where we're trying to make sure that you haven't just got sort of, when it's not in use, it's not just a kind of long blank street facade, but trying to find ways in which we can keep the street feeling activated.
We've run over, but if I may, because I've been really wanting to ask something myself. We've had amazing questions from the audience. Thank you very much. But you started the talk talking about the housing crisis and comparing the situation now to post-war era, when you know, hundreds of thousands of council homes were being built every year. I was interested in if there is a kind of, thinking about this much bigger situation then versus the, the really kind of tactical nature of your projects, is there a scale limit to your approach? If a local authority came to you and said, we want to build 2,000 units on a greenfield site, what would you say? I mean, that's a kind of ridiculous hypothetical, maybe sadly, but how far can the principles of your approach stretch to large scale housing estates that are potentially are needed?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, your mention of, I think, if we were asked to sort of build lots of homes in the greenbelt, we would obviously say no, because we shouldn't be building we should be building brownfield sites. And but an example of that, which I didn't show today, I was going to, and I just thought I'd run over time, is Pete Barber's 100 Mile City, which if people have a minute, type in 100 Mile City to Google and have a quick look, because this is an idea which came from, I'll try and summarize really quickly, I think there was a report by the Adam Smith Institute, which is a sort of fairly right-wing think tank, that the only solution to our housing crisis was to build into the greenbelt, was to kind of build these garden cities in places that used to be fields. And we really don't think that that's necessarily the right thing to do. Is London, if you take London as a city as an example, we have very low density in comparison to places like Paris and Barcelona. Barcelona, has a bit of a higher sun, but Paris very similar climatically to London. So there are lots of ways in which we can re-densify the city without building in our countryside. And the 100 Mile City is an idea that you build around the greenbelt, which is roughly 100 miles long, a rind of homes which are 200 meters sort of wide, if you like, so the streets running perpendicular 200 meters wide, all the way around the outer skirts of London, so where suburbia meets the greenbelt, and that you then densify a city from the outside in. And those sort of show that our type of housing over a much larger scale, and obviously that's a very polemic idea, and one that won't ever happen in reality, but is an idea that sort of tests it to the extreme, and thinks about how we can re-densify the city. So I think, it is applicable at a larger scale. I think, as you mentioned in the sort of brief and the kind of summary of this lecture series, though, there is benefit to plurality of authors of our built environment. And so I think, when you're sort of doing things at that scale, it's really good to have lots of people involved.
Absolutely, it's an amazing idea, and as you say, it sort of transcends that thing between the extremely tactical and the massive. It somehow brings them together in a really powerful way. Alice, thank you so much for your talk. Really, I mean, the evidence of the amazing questions and the discussion that's generated. So thank you very much indeed. So it's just time to draw things to a close. And we pick up the conversation next Wednesday with Gonzalo Herrera de Losada, who is currently working as curator for the New Museum of the Future in Dubai, and is associate lecturer at Central St Martin's. And this will be a complete change of tack. Gonzalo will be talking about how technologies coalescing around the notion of the multiverse will transform architectural experience. So if you're able to, please do join us then. And if you can, or if you can't, please also join us for future talks as well. It's all available on the Farrell Centre website, farrellcentre.org.uk. But Alice, thank you very much, and we hope to do this again in person next time.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks very much, Owen, and thanks everyone for coming along. Cheers.
Bye.